exact shape of the chair or the bed or the floor, whatever warm surface is holding you right now, and let it hold you fully, the way it has always been able to if you simply allow it. You have been carrying yourself all day, carrying the heavy weight of decisions, of winding conversations, and the small, accumulated ache of simply being a person in a loud world. And for the next little while, you absolutely do not have to do that anymore. The weight is not yours tonight. Let the soft thing beneath you take it all. Let your back release completely into it. Let your tired legs go heavy, and let your hands unclench and lie open, the way hands lie when they belong to someone who is completely, irrevocably at rest. There is a fire here. It is not a loud fire, not the high, snapping, crackling fire of a loud celebration, but the low, softly breathing fire of a night that has gone on long enough to settle beautifully into itself. The kind of fire that has burned down from something dramatic into something steady and amber and entirely sure. The wide hearth is made of smooth river stone, each stone polished by centuries of rushing water before some patient, careful hand placed it exactly here. The warmth it gives is not the sharp, direct, artificial warmth of a radiator or a vent, but the old generous warmth of stone that has been heated for hours and now releases it back into the room slowly, like a long, comforting exhale, like a gift given without any urgency at all. Feel it on your shins first. Feel that low, gentle heat finding your legs, moving steadily upward. The rain is at the window. Listen closely. It is coming from all directions tonight, wrapping this small cabin the way water wraps a stone in a stream, flowing smoothly around it, pouring over it, finding every wooden crevice and making its own delicate music in each one. Against the thick glass is a soft percussion, irregular enough to be interesting and regular enough to be deeply soothing. It is a pattern that your waking brain will eventually stop trying to decode and will simply absorb, the way it absorbs the sound of steady breathing in a quiet house where everyone you love is already fast asleep. Let your jaw go soft. You have been holding it tight. We all hold our jaws when the world outside is loud, clutching them together, bearing them like a heavy stone we carry in the face. And right now, in this enveloping warmth, with this rhythmic rain, you can finally let go. Let your tongue fall away from the roof of your mouth. Let your lips part just a breath's width, just enough to exhale more deeply. Breathe in through the nose, pulling the air all the way down into the belly, and let it out through the mouth in a long, unhurried thread of warm air. In and out, and again, deeper this time, slower. The breath going all the way down past your ribs and into the lowest part of your lungs, the part that rarely gets used on ordinary, anxious days, the part that belongs exclusively to calm. Feel your belly rise, and then your ribs, and then the very tops of your lungs last of all. Hold it for just a moment. Not tightly, just gently, the way you would cradle a sleeping thing, and then let it go. All of it. Everything you breathed in, and everything that came in with it. The lingering tension, the leftover worry, the loud thoughts that keep trying to be thoughts. Let them all go out with the breath and dissolve entirely into the warm, firelit air of the cabin. Your shoulders have dropped. Good. There was vastly more distance between your shoulders and your ears than you might have realized, and now the distance muscles of your neck are longer and softer, and the base of your skull has completely unclenched its stubborn grip on the day. Feel the profound relief of it moving down through your back, vertebra by vertebra. The upper back first, those knotted stones of tension between the shoulder blades, releasing one by one. Then the middle back, the lumbar, each bone settling perfectly onto the next, like a stack of smooth river stones, patient and final. The release moves down through your hips, down through your thighs. Heavy now, good and heavy. The absolute heaviness of a body that has decided it is done moving for the evening, that has given full permission to the bones and muscles to stop holding the rigid shape of motion and simply lie still. It moves down through your knees, which have carried you faithfully all day without ever being thanked for it, down into your calves, which know tiredness in their own particular way, a spreading warmth when you finally take the weight off them. Your ankles, those complicated, underappreciated joints, are loosening, and finally your feet and your toes, uncurling, spreading, going wonderfully soft in the warmth that radiates from the hearthstones and travels across the wooden floor to find you even at this distance. You are warm from the crown of your head to the soles of your feet. You are entirely held on the low table beside the chair, or beside the bed, or beside you on the soft floor. There is a book. It is a large book, heavier than most books have any right to be, bound in deep plush velvet, the colour of midnight. The title is stamped into its cover in gold letters that catch the flickering firelight, The Hidden Tales of Stardew Valley. The spine is worn in the exact way that beloved books are worn, not damaged, but thoroughly lived in. The leather softened at the edges by the passing of many hands, many quiet evenings, many tired people who sat exactly where you are sitting now and felt exactly what you are feeling. The warmth, the rain, the particular deep comfort of being given, for an hour, someone else's story to inhabit so that your own complex life can simply rest. The cover makes a soft sound when it opens, a low, satisfied creak, the sound of a heavy door to a secret room that has been patiently waiting to be entered. Tonight we will read the hidden stories of Pelican Town, not the stories you easily see on the surface, not the cheerful greetings in the sunlit town square, not the bustling market stalls and the lively seasonal festivals and the way everyone politely waves when you pass, not the facade. Tonight we read the stories that live deep underneath, the ones written in the quiet, lonely hours, the ones that absolutely no one tells at festivals, the ones that are truer and more tender and somewhat harder to bear. We will find great comfort in their quiet sorrows, because to deeply understand someone's tragedy is to truly love them, and love, even the one-sided love of a voice reading in the dark, even the gentle love between a listener and a story, is never, ever wasted. The fire breathes, the rain settles in against the glass. Turn the heavy parchment page to the first tale. There once was a man who stood at the edge of a cliff in Cindersap Forest, and the dark water was far below him, and the heavy rain was on his back, and he was thinking of absolutely nothing. Or rather, he was thinking of something that felt exactly like nothing, a grey and heavy nothingness, the kind that doesn't announce itself dramatically, but simply fills the space where feeling used to be, crowding it out so gradually that you don't notice the feeling is completely gone until one day you reach for it and your hand closes on empty air. His name was Shane, and the town, if asked, would have described him as difficult. Sullen, maybe. The kind of person who you said hello to and got a dismissive grunt in return, who sat at the same exact stool in the Star Drop saloon every single evening with the same warm mug and the same blank expression, who smelled faintly of alcohol and had the specific, haunted look of someone who had completely given up on a version of themselves they no longer remembered clearly enough to truly mourn. That was the town story. That was the surface of Shane. The stone face of him, turned outward, carrying the word unfriendly on it the exact way a heavy door carries the word closed. But a door can be closed for many different reasons. He walked the forest cliff because the southern bluffs were one of the only places near Pelican Town where absolutely no one would see him. From there, the water spread itself out below with a kind of vastness that was not comforting exactly, but profoundly honest. The natural world did not pretend. It did not have a cheerful face on the outside and a dark interior. It simply was what it was, enormous and indifferent and permanent, and Shane found, in his absolute worst moments, that he desperately needed to be near something that asked nothing of him. Not a performance, not self-improvement, not the constant, low-grade, exhausting effort of existing in a bright world designed for people who found existence vastly easier than he did. He worked at Joja Mart. This is the part of Shane's story that is easiest to misread as mere complaint, as the whining of a man who simply chose badly and should choose differently. But there is a specific, soul-crushing kind of suffering that belongs to spending 8 hours a day under buzzing fluorescent lighting in a place that has been designed at every level of its architecture and its ambient music and its mandatory smile policy to erase the very idea that the people working there are human beings at all. Joja Mart needed a mechanical function from Shane, not a person, and it paid him for the function and actively ignored the person. After enough years, the gap between what was acknowledged and what actually existed became, for Shane, the entirety of the problem. He couldn't point to it cleanly. He couldn't say, "This massive corporation has made me feel like nothing." He could only feel the nothingness, like a freezing tide that had come in so slowly he hadn't noticed until the dark water was right at his chin. He could have been a farmer. He almost was, in some essential animal sense. A man who gently raised things and watched them grow and knew the fragile weight of a warm egg and the particular small trust of a creature who knows your footsteps long before it hears your voice. His love of poultry was not a quirk, not a silly hobby. It was a remnant of something deeply real that had survived the long years of fluorescent light mostly intact, the way certain hardy seeds survive a brutal winter and are still totally viable underneath the frost. He loved his hens. He knew their personalities individually, and this is not a small thing. To extend that kind of deep, observant attention to a creature that cannot tell you it notices. And there was Jazz, his goddaughter, the child of a friend who is no longer in the world, whose terrible absence is the wound underneath all of Shane's other wounds, the one that sources them. He is the one who patiently reads to her. He is the one who buys her extra pizza at the saloon because she mentioned offhandedly that she liked it. He is the one who stubbornly sits between her small, innocent life and his own much darkness and tries every single day to be something other than what he is, just for her sake, because she deserves so much better than what he has to give. But she is his, and he will absolutely not let her know how incredibly thin the margin is. Depression does not feel like simple sadness. This is the part that is the hardest to explain from the outside. The part that makes it so hard to help someone like Shane. You look at him and you think, but what is he so sad about? And the answer is that it is not sadness. Sadness has a specific gravity, a direction, a source you can easily point to. What Shane carries is more like a leaden weight, distributed so perfectly evenly through every single part of his life that it becomes the very oxygen of the room. Invisible, present, absolutely everywhere. The thing that everything else has to forcefully breathe through. It makes the small things impossibly hard, not just the large things. It makes getting up hard. It makes caring about getting up hard. It makes it hard to care about the fact that you don't care, and that particular recursion, the downward spiral that starts with numbness and ends with numbness again, is the specific, suffocating texture of the thing that brought him to the wet cliffside. And then, gradually, slowly, in the way that all real healing happens in ways that cannot be neatly plotted on a graph, something profound shifted. The farmer came, and the farmer kept coming back, even when Shane was difficult, even when he was dismissive, or cold, or simply completely absent behind his own eyes. There is a particular kind of stubborn persistence that does not announce itself as heroism. It simply shows up. It buys a hot pepper at the market. It sits quietly nearby at the saloon. It waits without pushing. It returns the very next day. And Shane, whose heavy defences had been built specifically to outlast people, because everyone left eventually, everyone gave up, everyone decided the function was not worth the difficulty of the person, did not know at first what to do with someone who simply did not leave. He opened, eventually, not all at once, and certainly not in a dramatic, sweeping moment of revelation, in small, agonizing increments, the way a painted window opens in a room that has been closed far too long. Slowly, with great resistance, letting in the fresh air a little at a time. He showed the farmer the chickens. He talked passionately about a new breed, a blue chicken, gentle and ridiculous, and somehow exactly the animal version of the Shane that existed before the grey nothingness set in. He cried, once, in the presence of another living person, and did not die from it, which surprised him enormously. He still goes to the cliff sometimes, but now, when he goes, he looks at the ocean and thinks of the blue chickens waiting in the warm coop, and he turns around and he comes back. That is the whole story. That is the part that looks small from the outside. A man, some chickens, a walk back from a cliff, but contains, if you hold it to the exact right light, something very large. The beautiful possibility that the version of yourself you thought was gone forever might simply be waiting, very quietly, in a coop behind someone's house, for you to finally come and find it. There once was a girl who read by flashlight in the dark, long after the rest of the cramped metal trailer had gone to sleep, or what passed for sleep, which was the heavy, laboured breathing from the other side of the thin partition wall, the breathing of a person whose rest was a kind of managed chemical collapse collapse rather than a true peace. She moved her lips silently along the words of other people's stories, because other people's stories were the absolutely only door she could find that opened onto a world vastly larger than this one. Her name was Penny, and the town, if asked, would have described her as kind, sweet maybe. The school teacher, not officially, not with a framed certificate or a steady salary, but in absolute practice. She gathered the children of the town at the riverside and taught them in the way that people teach when they deeply love the act of it rather than the credential, with patient repetition and the particular radiant warmth of someone who finds children vastly easier to love than most grown people. Children are still wonderfully transparent, still completely honest about what they need, still entirely capable of the specific delight that tired adults forget is even available. That was the surface of Penny, the gentle, capable, softly smiling surface. The interior was entirely different. The interior was the sound of Pam coming home, or not coming home, and the exhausting hours of calculation that followed. Was she still at the saloon? And would she try to drive herself home? And should Penny call Gus to make absolutely sure she left with a safe ride? These were not extraordinary thoughts in Penny's life. They were the ordinary, relentless background music, the administrative overlay that ran constantly beneath everything else she did. She had been running this particular emotional administration since she was old enough to understand that the administration was solely hers, because there was no one else. There had just never been anyone else. There was Pam, who loved her in the messy, chaotic way that people love their children when they are also quite deeply lost themselves, genuinely and incompletely, with the massive gaps filled by alcohol and avoidance, gaps that a young child learns to step into and bridge with her own small body, because the alternative is the terrifying gap, which is worse. Parentification is a sterile word that means your childhood was a full-time job. It means that the developmental period in which a person is supposed to be learning how to be a person, learning what they genuinely want, what they feel, what they need, how those things can be clearly asked for and sometimes joyfully received, was instead spent learning exactly how to manage someone else's needs, someone else's volatile moods, someone else's administrative requirements. The survival skills you developed in this period are extremely useful in a crisis and not very useful for joy. You become excellent at hyper-vigilant anticipation. You become excellent at gauging a room's exact emotional temperature from the hallway before you even enter. You become excellent at need assessment and schedule management and the incredibly quiet arts of smoothing over and making do. You become, in short, a perfect caretaker. Caretaking is genuinely valuable. It is one of the most genuinely valuable things a person can be, except that when it is learned not by willing choice but by sheer survival, it tends to come with a hidden, devastating clause that your own needs are always secondary, that the constant maintenance of others' comfort takes precedence, that somewhere in the exhausting process of learning to care for absolutely everyone else, you forgot, or never quite managed, to learn to care for yourself. Penny's deep dreams lived only in books. This is not a metaphor, it is the literal architecture of her interior life. The bustling city she had never been to, pages of borrowed library volumes, the grand museums, and the wide rivers, and the hushed reading rooms with their tall windows, and the specific smell of serious, accumulated knowledge. The credential she wanted so badly, a real teaching certificate, a real classroom, a set of small wooden desks that belonged completely to her, the future in which she was finally allowed to be the main protagonist of her own life, rather than the tired supporting character in her mother's. These lived in books while the batteries in the flashlight held out, and when the flashlight finally gave out, they lived in the dark, close to her chest, and careful, waiting patiently for morning. What the farmer offered her was simpler and far more radical than anything she had planned for. The farmer simply noticed her, not her quiet competence, not her usefulness, her. The way she looked when she was fully concentrating on something she loved. The way she offered information with a small private pleasure, like someone handing you a beautiful shell they found and sincerely hoped you'd also find interesting. The farmer kept coming back, not because Penny was performing her best, most competent self, but simply because she was there, and being there was more than enough. She was not used to being enough. She wept about it, privately, in the way very controlled, parentified people weep, efficiently, fully, with the window tightly closed so no one could hear. And afterwards she felt something she couldn't quite name for several days, until she finally identified it as hope, a specific, terrifying, completely unfamiliar hope, the kind that requires you to actually want something entirely for yourself, which is the hardest wanting there is for someone who has spent a lifetime practicing the exact opposite. She began allowing herself, slowly and with great terrifying resistance, to want. That is the whole of her story. A girl in a rusted metal trailer, reading by a fading flashlight, the rain hammering on the tin roof, the long, patient practice of wanting nothing. And then, a gentle knock at the door, regular as the changing seasons, asking absolutely nothing except that she simply be home when it came. There once was a boy who lived underground, and underground is not a metaphor, or not only a metaphor, it is the literal, physical fact of Sebastian's room. It was situated below the grade of the wooden house, below the natural sight lines of the windows, reached by a creaking staircase that absolutely no one in the household descended without a specific invitation, and an invitation was rarely, if ever, offered. The room constantly hummed. It hummed with the sound of tall servo fans that never stopped, never slept, that provided the basement with a constant mechanical breathing, the soothing sound of a machine sustaining itself faithfully through the night. This was, not coincidentally, the exact sound Sebastian found most deeply peaceful, because machines were completely clear about what they needed, and perfectly consistent about what they gave, and people were neither of those things. His multiple monitors cast a deep blue light. It was not the warm amber of the fire upstairs, not the yellow of a reading lamp, but the specific blue-white light of screens that are always on, that know absolutely no difference between 2 in the afternoon and 2 in the morning, that hold their steady luminosity constant regardless of the hour. Sebastian lived in this pale light the exact way certain shade-loving plants live in low light conditions, not thriving exactly, fully adapted, completely accustomed, the biology thoroughly reorganized around what was available. He was Robin's son. This is the complex genealogy of his living situation. The bare, undeniable fact of it. Robin married Demetrius, and Demetrius and Robin had Maru, and Maru was brilliant and present and deeply beloved in the specific way that children are beloved in new families, the way they anchor the new arrangement to something true, something that was undeniably true before the arrangement existed. And Sebastian was not Demetrius's son. He was Robin's, from before, from a previous arrangement that didn't survive, from a father who is not in the picture so comprehensively that he is not even in the town, not even in the story, except as his heavy, lingering absence. And Demetrius loved Robin, and Robin loved Demetrius, and they were, in the broad light of day, a family, and Sebastian was in the family in the highly technical, structural sense of being physically present in the house and occasionally sharing meals and occupying a reluctant space in the family photograph. But to be present in a house is not at all the same as to truly belong in it. The most difficult thing about being the stepchild in a family with a brilliant biological child is that the comparison is not always spoken out loud. Sometimes it doesn't need to be. It lives quietly in the way pride distributes itself in a room. The specific, glowing pride that Demetrius bore for Maru, carried openly, discussed freely, footnoted with shining trophies and science fair ribbons and the impressive letters from universities that lay casually on the kitchen counter where absolutely everyone could see them. And there were absolutely no equivalent letters for Sebastian, no equivalent trophies, no equivalent pride worn openly and easily in the house. His freelance work was invisible to Demetrius. Code is invisible, always invisible, unless you know exactly how to read it. And Demetrius did not, or simply did not try to. And the profound invisibility of the work made Sebastian himself feel, by slow, agonizing extension, entirely invisible. He wasn't hated. He wasn't even disliked. He was simply not quite registered, not quite seen. He smoked on the roof sometimes, or by the mountain lake in the rain when the basement felt far too small, and he was building a motorcycle. The motorcycle is the absolute key to Sebastian's interior life. Not the geographical destination the motorcycle would reach, not the specific paved road, but the act of construction itself and the heavily implied act of departure. Every bolt he set into the metal frame was a future mile. Every piece of the engine he carefully assembled from salvage was another increment of freedom. Not freedom from something terrible, not freedom from active cruelty or physical danger, but freedom from the specific, quiet suffocation of being unremarkable in your own home. Freedom from being the strange variable that the family equation works despite rather than because of. He wanted to get on the motorcycle and go somewhere that no one knew him by default, somewhere he could be exactly whoever he was without the fixed blinding contrast of Maru's ascension making the comparison automatic. He was solitary, not because he despised company, but because he had learned very early that company always came with a steep cost. The cost of the performance required, the constant management of how he was perceived, the exhausting daily labour of trying to be enough in a room where enough had already been defined by someone who was distinctly not him. light, he wrote code that solved real problems for real clients who judged him only by the clean, undeniable elegance of his work. And his work, when it was only his, was very, very good. The farmer found him underground, not figuratively, literally came down the wooden stairs without drama, without a loud announcement, and sat. The farmer had the specific, highly unusual quality of not needing to fill comfortable silence with nervous performance. The farmer sat in the blue light and didn't ask why the room was so dark, or when Sebastian was going to come upstairs, or whether he had thought about applying for something vastly more stable. The farmer simply was there, possessing the quality of a person who finds no contradiction whatsoever between solitude and company, who can be fully present in a room without making their presence into a demand. Sebastian had not known that was even possible. The motorcycle is still being built. He will finish it. And when he does, the road he rides it down will be longer because of the farmer. Longer, and possibly in ways he does not yet entirely understand. Not the roadway that he imagined, but something vastly more complicated and much more worth the riding. He still lives in the basement, but the staircase is far less forbidding now, and he goes upstairs sometimes without being called. And this is not nothing. This is in fact absolutely everything. There once was a boy who learned very early that the absolutely only safe place in the world was inside his own physical body. That the body, unlike the chaotic house, unlike the volatile faces of the people in the house, could be relied upon to do exactly what it was asked if you simply asked it consistently and without a single ounce of mercy. His name was Alex, and his handsome face told one story, and his interior told another, and the vast distance between them was the whole measure of exactly how hard he had worked to protect himself from a world that had, in his experience, a brutal tendency to leave. He was broad-shouldered and easy-smiling, and loud in the exact way of someone who has decided that taking up space aggressively is the absolute best strategy for a person who has been made to feel at a foundational level that they don't deserve any space at all. He played gridball, not only because he loved it, which he did genuinely, with his body loving it the way bodies love the things they're beautifully built for, but because intense athletics gave him the only framework he knew for proving his worth. You run faster, you hit harder, you push through the blinding pain until your legs simply cannot carry you anymore. And if you do all of this correctly, in front of the exact right people, the worth is suddenly visible. The worth is scored. The worth is in the record, the numbers, the time, the distance covered. External, universally agreed upon, completely undeniable. Alex had not learned any other way to make his worth legible. He had been taught, very young, by a man who was supposed to love him unconditionally, that conditions were absolutely everything. His father called him worthless. This requires sitting with, not the way abusive fathers often do in stories, not with the theatrical, dramatic cruelty of a cartoon villain, but in the routine, carelessly devastating way of a man who was, himself, in deep pain, and had decided that his pain was somehow Alex's fault. He communicated this through 1,000 small and large moments over the formative years of Alex's childhood. Moments exactly like shrapnel, the kind that don't kill on impact but lodge deep in the tissue and work their way further in over time. You'll never make it. You're not as good as you think you are. You think anyone's going to put real money on you. It was the specific, crushing lexicon of a man who had completely given up on his own ambitions and was aggressively determined that his son should not be allowed to surpass what he himself had been unable to achieve, because that surpassing would be a permanent indictment. Alex remembered him mostly in fragments, and his mother remembered him differently. Or rather, Alex remembered his mother's memory, the beautifully soft version she had curated for him in the quiet years before the illness finally took her. Clara. Her name was Clara, and she was not a large presence in his life in terms of time. She died when he was still young enough that her memory belongs exclusively to the sensory category rather than the narrative one. But her absence was enormous, and shaped specifically exactly like her, like the negative space of a person who was profoundly warm, who smelled like a particular floral thing that he could no longer name, who laughed at silly things he said in a way that made him feel funny and therefore real. When his mother died, his father left, and Alex went to live with his grandparents, Evelyn and George, the two old people who sat in the house on the east side of the valley and tended their beautiful garden and their small life with the deep patience of people who had survived enough to know what was actually worth surviving for. They loved him. They were not dramatic about it. They were old, and old love tends to be quiet and incredibly practical rather than expressive. But it was steady love, reliable love, the specific love of people who had decided to be there and were simply, continuously, faithfully there. Alex knew this. He was not ungrateful, but he also woke up at 3 in the morning sometimes and did intense push-ups in the dark. He did them because the quiet of 3 in the morning was the quiet in which his father's awful voice was the absolute loudest. Not literally, but in the way that the toxic voices we internalize perfectly fill the silence we cannot fill with noise. Worthless. The heavy word sitting in the chest, exactly like a stone. And the push-ups were not exercise at 3 in the morning. They were a desperate argument, a physical, exhausting, muscle-tearing argument with a voice that would not shut up. An argument that went, look what I can do, look what this body can do. The body you said was not enough. Look. Eventually the arms would give out, and the argument would pause, and the heavy silence would return, and he would press his flushed face into the cold, wet grass, and simply breathe until he could finally breathe normally again. His dog watched. Dusty, the loyal dog, present at the wooden pen every single morning, like a fixed point. The one relationship in Alex's life that required absolutely nothing from him, except that he show up, which he always did. He showed up for the dog. He was good to the dog, and the dog looked at him with a total, uncomplicated acceptance. The dogs unconditionally apply to their people, which is a love that does not care what you have achieved. That does not check your athletic record. That does not ever find you wanting. The farmer arrived, and Alex did what he always did, performed. He performed the easy confidence, the casual strength, the assumption that the farmer probably found him incredibly impressive, because impressive was the absolutely only idiom he spoke. And the farmer, frustratingly, surprisingly, somewhat infuriatingly, was not particularly interested in impressive, was interested instead in the other things. The way he talked softly about his mother when the subject came up, briefly and with a care that suggested the subject was as fragile as glass. The way he was with his grandparents, extremely patient with George's gruff stubbornness, and incredibly gentle with Evelyn, in the way that people are gentle with people they know are more important than the social calculus acknowledges. The way he looked at the dog. You can tell a great deal about a person from the exact way they look at their dog. The armour did not simply fall. It was more like the armour was quietly, incrementally made redundant. Each encounter with the farmer adding a small reason not to need it, until the need diminished enough that the armour became simply heavy rather than necessary. He talked about Clara. He talked about the push-ups. He talked about 3 in the morning, and the awful voice in his chest, and the farmer listened in the exact way that people listen when they are not waiting for their turn to speak fully, without the face of someone composing a response, simply there for the words themselves. He still does push-ups sometimes, but often now he does them in the warm daylight for the much better reason, for the absolute joy of the thing his healthy body can do. And this is the difference, this small and enormous difference between exercise as an argument and exercise as a celebration. There once was a woman who lived completely alone in the woods, and the woods were not metaphorical. The actual, literal woods at the southern edge of the valley, in a cabin that was drafty by artistic design or by simple neglect. It was extremely hard to tell which. It had a long workbench along one wall, and sawdust on the floor, and the specific, wonderful smell of fresh cut pine and artistic intention, of a life organised entirely around the making of things from exactly what the earth freely provides. Her name was Leah, and the town, if asked, would have described her as quiet, independent, the kind of person who seemed to profoundly belong exactly where she was, who fit the woods the way a key fits a particular lock, who moved through the towering trees in the early morning with the grace and ease of someone who has made total peace with solitude. She made beautiful sculptures, from wood mostly, though sometimes stone, sometimes whatever interesting shape she found on the forest floor. And the sculptures had a quality that was incredibly hard to name, but extremely easy to feel. The distinct sense that the forms were always perfectly there, inside the material, and she had simply removed everything that wasn't them. She sold a few now and then. She showed her work occasionally. She existed in the deep woods, and the woods, generously, existed all around her. That was the surface. The interior was a phone that rang sometimes in the lonely evenings, and the way Leah's whole body completely changed when it rang. The sudden stillness, the held breath, the specific calculation happening deeply behind her eyes, and she either answered it or she didn't, and both choices cost something immense. Kel, the voice on the other end of the phone, calling from the bustling city, from the life she had bravely left, or been pushed from, depending on the angle, was the voice of someone who had said, "You're making a massive mistake," who had said, "Art doesn't pay," who had said, "You can't build a life on this," and by this had meant on something that isn't practical, something that doesn't generate the kind of income that would justify the kind of comfortable life I want us to have. And what they were really saying, beneath all of it, was, I need you to be someone other than who you actually are. Leah had painfully chosen herself over Kel. Or rather, she had slowly understood that staying with Kel would require a gradual, incremental self-erasure, the kind that happens so incredibly slowly you don't see it as erasure, but simply as an adjustment, simply as a compromise. And one day you look up and you are very adjusted and very compromised, and the person who used to stand in the forest and feel something enormous and unnamed when the light came through the trees is not someone you recognise anymore. So she packed what she could and she came to the valley, and the valley was, in its way, overwhelmingly beautiful. And the work was good, genuinely good. The work she made in the drafty cabin was the absolute best work she'd ever made, because true fear makes certain things go sharper. Pain strips away the aesthetic decisions that are really just comfort and leaves only the pure, the essential. And she knew it was good, but knowing the work was good and knowing it would sustain her were two entirely different certainties, and only one of them was reliable. The bitter cold that seeped through the cabin walls in winter was a fact. The modest money she made from the occasional sale was a fact. The rapidly narrowing margin between the two was a terrifying fact, and on the quiet nights the phone rang and she sat with her hands tightly in her lap and listened to it cycle through to silence. The fact sat with her very, very heavily. She was deeply afraid of having made the wrong choice. This is the specific, hollow fear of people who have chosen vision over absolute security. Not the fear that the vision was inherently wrong, but the fear that the choosing of vision was itself the tragic error, that you were supposed to be the practical person, that the demanding voice on the phone was right, and the romantic woods were a delusion, and the sculptures are very beautiful, but beauty does not keep the heat on in freezing February. It is a fear that visits at night mostly. During the bright day, the physical work has a gravity that firmly holds the fear at bay, gives it no purchase. But at night, it sits beside you in the drafty cabin and coldly stares at the budget and says, "See, the farmer came to the forest, and the farmer gladly ate the forage food she offered without auditing it for adequacy, sat in the small cabin without ever noting its smallness, asked about the work, specifically about the work, about what this piece meant and how that one started, and what particular wood she preferred for figures that were supposed to suggest flowing water, and listened to the answers with the face of someone who completely understands that the answers are important, that the domain is real, that the person speaking in it is not a silly hobbyist managing a pleasant eccentricity, but a deeply serious person doing serious work in the absolute only way she knows how." The phone still rings occasionally. It rings much less than it used to, because Kel learned, eventually, imperfectly, that she is never coming back, and the calls are tapering in the exact way that all things taper when the hope that sustains them is finally acknowledged as entirely gone. And Leah sits in the cabin, sometimes in the dark evenings, and listens to the heavy rain on the roof and the crackling fire in the grate, and looks at the work in progress on the wooden bench, and feels something she's been very careful not to call absolute peace, because the margin is still somewhat thin, and the cold still creeps in at the edges, but something in its family, something beautifully patient and enduring and entirely hers. There once was a woman who was always completely okay, who wore her okayness the way other people wear their best clothes, with intense intention and care, and the specific effort of someone who knows that the maintenance of the appearance is also, somehow, the maintenance of the thing itself, or has persuaded herself of this over so many years of rigorous maintenance that the distinction has become purely academic. Her name was Emily, and the town, if asked, would have described her as radiant, warm, the kind of person whose presence in a room made the room instantly warmer, who happily remembered your name and the small thing you mentioned once in passing, and thoughtfully asked about it the very next time she saw you, who worked at the saloon and brought to that work a specific quality of absolute attention that made each person she served feel they were being truly seen rather than processed. She kept glowing crystals in her room. She meditated deeply by candlelight in the quiet evenings. She made her own clothes from soft fabric she dyed herself, and the clothes were strange and brilliantly beautiful in the way that things made by people who have stopped consulting anyone else's taste eventually are. She was perfectly centered. She was intensely spiritual. She was, in the town's complete understanding, completely fine. The surface was exceptionally well maintained. Her parents had gone travelling to the distant Fern Islands when she was 20, and Haley was 17, and had framed this as a grand adventure, as an opportunity, as a wonderful gift of the house and the self-determination that came with it, which it was, in the way that all things given without being asked for are gifts of a specific, ambivalent variety. The large house was real. The self-determination was real. The opportunity was theoretically real. What was also deeply real was a specific, foundational thing that they had taken with them when they packed their bags and left, the thing that made a house a home and made self-determination bearable rather than simply isolating, which was the physical presence of people who had chosen to stay. Emily did not allow herself, for a single second, to frame this as abandonment. She had a vocabulary, a rich, careful, heavily spiritually inflected vocabulary, reframing difficulty as profound growth, loss as vast opportunity, abandonment as absolute liberation. This is not wrong exactly, and is even highly useful in certain doses and certain contexts, but it becomes, when applied exhaustively and without any exception to every painful experience, a powerful way of avoiding the experiences rather than actually processing them. Spiritual bypassing is the clinical name for it. The use of spiritual practice not to deeply encounter the difficult interior, but to cleverly route around it, to climb right over it on the ladder of higher meaning, without ever having to actually stand in the cold room where the difficult thing actually lives. Emily stood very skillfully on the beautiful landing far above that room. The room below contained something quite simple and devastating. A nearly grown girl and a younger teenager, standing entirely alone in a house that used to belong to their whole family and now belonged exclusively to them, in a valley at the end of a long road, in the specific quiet of a space from which the people who almost immediately, had found the higher meaning in it, the growth, the opening of dazzling new possibility, and had continued aggressively converting ever since, every single time the original painful fact of it tried to surface. The sparkling crystals were not a cure. The deep meditation was not a resolution. They were, if you looked at them clearly, if you gently removed the spiritual wrapper and looked at what they were actually doing in Emily's actual daily life, they were a highly sophisticated maintenance system for a person who was profoundly alone and had decided that the aloneness was wonderfully chosen, was valuable, was a fantastic feature rather than a deep wound, which is a kind of profound wisdom in a way, which is also a kind of immense grief that has been reorganized so many times it absolutely no longer recognizes itself. She made things beautiful. The house was beautiful. She maintained it, tended it, fiercely loved it, in a way that Hayley couldn't quite manage, because Hayley's complicated relationship to the house was tightly knotted with all the things Emily had smoothed over. She made beautiful clothes and wore them beautifully, and arranged her space beautifully, and moved through the busy saloon beautifully, and was, to most people's eyes, exactly what she appeared to be, a woman who had found her absolute centre and was totally oriented to it. What she really was someone who had decided feeling better was exactly the same as actually feeling. The farmer, characteristically, did not engage with the bright performance, or rather, did engage with Emily, but specifically with the parts of the performance that were also deeply authentic, which required some careful discernment, because many of Emily's performances were also completely true. She genuinely loved the crystals, genuinely loved the meditation, genuinely found something in the ritual of colour and fabric that was not compensatory, but simply real and entirely hers. The farmer engaged with that, with the messy dye-in process and the fabric selection, and the way she talked about colour as though it had a deep grammar she had spent years learning to read. And in being truly seen in the real things, Emily found that the massive distance between the real and the performed significantly narrowed, became vastly harder to maintain, because she was no longer performing for someone who actually required a performance. She cried once, in total private, after a particular conversation that she couldn't quite account for, couldn't trace back to a single thing that was said, because it wasn't any single thing that was said, but the broader, overwhelming accumulation of being truly known over time, which is its own kind of total undoing of the careful, beautiful architecture of the maintained service. And she was okay, the actual, real kind of okay. There once was a girl who stood very, very still in front of large mirrors, and the standing was not simple vanity, or not only vanity, it was something much closer to a frantic vigil. Her name was Hayley, and the town, if asked, would have described her as beautiful and incredibly difficult, which is exactly how towns describe beautiful women who flatly refuse to perform warmth on demand, who have not yet made their peace with a world they find incompletely trustworthy. She had long, pale gold hair that she brushed for exactly 100 strokes every single evening. The count was never quite exact. She was counting by feel rather than a strict number, but the rhythmic, hypnotic repetition of it was the entire point, the steady physical ritual of something she could do perfectly in a world that had been completely imperfect. She arranged her clothes with a precision that the town mistakenly read as superficiality, but was actually its absolute opposite. Hayley was just 17 when her parents casually packed for the distant Fern Islands. She remembers the packing vividly. She has tried to forget it, has tried very hard to replace it with the version of events that sounds a little less like what it actually was. But the specific detail of the packing has stayed permanently burned in. The efficient, breezy way her parents moved through the house, assessing and sorting what goes and what stays. The entire life reduced to what fits in 2 large suitcases and what remains behind. And what remained behind was Hayley. And Emily, yes, Emily was always there. Emily was always smilingly present and increasingly self-sufficient in ways that Hayley was definitely not, that Hayley had not needed to be, because Emily was, but Hayley was 17 and had not been consulted, and the house was suddenly very, very large and very, very quiet, and the sound of her parents' car disappearing down the dirt road was a silence that was incredibly louder than sound. She took up photography. Not consciously, not as helpful therapy. Hayley would have been utterly appalled at the word therapy, at the implication that something inside her required fixing, which is itself a clear symptom of the wound. The absolute refusal to acknowledge the wound, because acknowledging it would mean having to sit in the cold room of it, and the room, as established, is not somewhere she ever goes. But the heavy camera gave her something crucial: a frame, a solid boundary around a highly selected piece of reality held up to the eye, the absolute decision of what to include and what to completely exclude being entirely, powerfully, irrevocably hers. The camera was the one thing her parents had not packed, or rather, the camera was a beautiful metaphor for the decision-making capacity that she was fiercely determined to exercise in every area of her life, now that she deeply understood the world's tendency to make massive decisions without consulting her. The sheer terror of aging arrived very early for her. This is the specific, bleeding wound in Hayley's chest, not the natural fact of aging itself, which is universal and unremarkable, but the terror that aging will eventually make her less worth keeping. The fear that the thing which makes her valuable in the world's cold accounting is the specific youth and beauty she currently holds, and that when these taper, as they will, because absolutely everything tapers, whatever made her worth staying for will taper completely with them. This fear was planted deeply by parents who simply left. The awful equation their leaving implied was not conscious, but it ran beneath everything she did, like a humming live wire. If the people who were supposed to love you unconditionally went to the Fern Islands instead, then love clearly does have harsh conditions, and you should quickly work out what conditions you can reliably meet and meet them continuously. The conditions she could meet most obviously were the ones that loudly advertise themselves: being beautiful, being exactly the kind of beautiful that other people desperately want to be near. So, she was beautiful, and carefully, and continuously, and Emily, one room over, burned her candle, and meditated, and filled the house with the sweet incense and the warmth of someone who had made a smiling peace with things. And Hayley, who had not made peace with things, who had absolutely no vocabulary and no framework and no spiritual practice for the specific anger and deep fear she carried, sometimes intensely resented this. And then she was deeply fiercely ashamed of the resentment, and then she fiercely resented the shame, and the whole cycle was profoundly exhausting, and it showed in absolutely nothing, except the way she was sometimes vastly sharper than necessary with people who had not specifically earned it. She was protecting herself, the exact way people desperately protect what they're most afraid of losing. The farmer arrived and made the inexplicable decision to keep arriving, and Haley, who was prepared, even highly skilled, at being difficult in ways that made people immediately leave, who had cultivated this skill years ago as an early warning system for fair weather company, did not quite understand what to do with someone who simply registered the difficulty and cheerfully showed up again the next day. She tested this comprehensively. She was completely dismissive, and the farmer came back. She was freezing cold, and the farmer came back. She was, when she was feeling particularly cornered by the gentle approach, deeply cutting, and the farmer came back. She softened eventually. Not completely. That particular set of sharp edges absolutely belongs to her. They are hard-earned and not entirely without value. But enough. Enough that she went home from a long walk one evening and looked at the glowing photographs she had taken that day, and suddenly realised she had been photographing the beautiful valley, the golden fields, the winding river, the light on the wet cobblestones, and not herself, and that this was new, and that it meant something she was absolutely not ready to say out loud, but could deeply feel. The undeniable evidence that her attention finally had somewhere else to go, that she had discovered something outside the mirror worth looking at. The 100 strokes of the brush at night, she still does them, but sometimes she loses count around 60 and simply stops. And this, for Haley, is massive progress. This is enormous. There once was a boy whose best music teacher was the slanted roof of his own house, who had learned the guitar by listening very carefully to an old record that skipped badly on the third track, by teaching himself the chord shapes that simply felt right from pure feel rather than stuffy instruction, who played quietly at first, and then with bright confidence, and then quietly again when the situation heavily required quiet, which increasingly, in his house, it did. His name was Sam, and the town, if asked, would have described him as fun, easygoing, the one who was always up for absolutely something, who moved through the town the way young men who are well liked move through small towns, with a degree of frictionlessness born of being known and not requiring any particular effort from the people who casually knew him. He skateboarded. He was good at it in the competent, untrained way of someone who completely taught himself a physical language on the exact same principle as the guitar. From feel, from repetition, from the body's sheer willingness to learn what the hard ground would teach it. He genuinely liked people. He was genuinely, easily liked. His father was away at war. Kent was his father's name, and Kent has been a solid presence in Sam's life at the foundational level, the level of early childhood, of the structure of absolute normalcy, of what a house sounds like and what warm evenings look like when the person who is supposed to be there is actually there. And then Kent was not there, was deployed to the Gotoro Empire, and Sam was 12 or 13, old enough to fully understand the terrifying absence, too young to fully understand what the absence meant. He carried the heavy weight of it in the way children carry weights they don't don't have words for, by immediately becoming more responsible, by becoming the older person in the room, by learning to carefully read his mother's face for signs of the deep strain that he could not fix, but might, if he was very good and very present, marginally relieve. He became the man of the house, not because anyone asked him to. Jody would not have asked this, would not have framed it this way, and worked very hard, in fact, to allow Sam and Vincent to be children, to not lay the crushing structural weight of Kent's deployment on them explicitly, but the weight laid itself. It was in the heavy air of the house, the particular quality of tense quiet in the evenings when it was just the three of them, the way Jody's small shoulders looked when the thick bills came in, the way the house organised itself around a terrifying absence that was not accounted for in its original architecture. Sam read this. He was very good at reading rooms. The way children who grow up in anxious households develop a sharp skill for it. The way it becomes a vital form of protection. And he quickly adjusted himself to exactly what the reading required. He made Vincent laugh loudly. He helped chop vegetables for dinner. He did not ever mention, on the particularly hard days, that the front lawn needed mowing, or the car was making a strange new sound, because these were tasks his father did, and to mention them was to mention his father and his father's terrifying absence, and the whole cascade of awful things that lived in that absence. He protected Jody by absolutely not making her look at what was hardest to look at. He was 12, 13, 14, doing this daily. The acoustic guitar waited in the corner of his room. The music patiently waited. And then Kent finally came home. And the relief, the enormous, encompassing, weeping relief of it, lasted approximately 3 days. And then Sam slowly understood that the person who had come home was not entirely the person who had left. Kent sat very stiffly in the chair and did not want to talk about what he'd seen, and woke in the night to sounds that absolutely no one else in the house could hear, and violently flinched at falling things, and heavily paced the hall in the dark hour, and was present in the house in the way of someone who is physically present, but has completely left a massive part of themselves in the burning terrain they could not bring home. Sam could not fix this. This was the new, impossible weight, the heavier weight after the returning. You waited and you prayed and you hoped, and the person finally came back, and they are here. They are completely alive. They are sitting right there in the chair. And also, they are not quite the same, and the not quite sameness is not something you can address or improve or help with, because it belongs exclusively to experiences you will absolutely never have access to, and wounds that require an entirely different kind of tending than anything Sam remotely knows how to provide. He plays the guitar very, very quietly at night, in the room right above the hall where his father sometimes paces, because the music is the only conversation he knows how to have with the silence his father has completely become. He wants to start a band. He has wanted this for years. Sebastian was ready on the drums, and Abigail had been loudly practicing her keyboard, the loud idea having a shape and a name emerging from it. And this deep wanting is itself a form of survival, the continuation of the part of Sam that belongs exclusively to Sam, rather than to the endless management of other people's trauma. The farmer showed up and actually listened to him play, and it was not a polite, obliging listening, the kind where you keep your face arranged in appropriate appreciation, but an actual, deep one, the kind where you stop doing whatever else you were doing and simply hear the music, which is all music really asks, which is all Sam has ever really been asking for. He wrote a song once that he hasn't played for anyone yet, but he will. There once was a girl who grew up in a house that was not, she deeply suspected, the house she was ever supposed to have been born in, who grew up in the warm, ordinary, slightly suffocating comfort of Pierre's house over the bustling general store, and felt, from the very beginning, and with a consistency that she could not account for, that there had been some massive clerical error at the level of origin, that she was a page accidentally filed in the completely wrong drawer, that the deep purple in her hair, the vibrant colour that mysteriously appeared and had never, in any amount of frantic washing, entirely disappeared, was undeniable evidence of something the house was absolutely not equipped to explain. Her name was Abigail, and the town, if asked, would have described her as strange, interesting, some of them, the more generous ones, or unconventional, which is the exact word used for interesting when the utterer is not quite sure it's a compliment. She was powerfully drawn to the dark places, the damp caves at the rocky edge of the valley, the wizard stone tower in the deep woods, the late, creeping hours when the valley's ambient cheerfulness had gone to bed, and absolutely only the shadows and the rushing river and the weight of the mountain were still awake. She claimed to eat quartz rocks, with the particular dry humour of someone who has found the myth of their own strangeness highly useful for keeping nosy people at a specific distance. She played her flute at odd hours, completely alone. Pierre was a nice man. This is the complication. He was not a bad father, not in the terrible ways that make the story simple, not through active cruelty or negligence or absence. He was extremely present and earnest, and worked incredibly hard at his shop, and tried, within his limited capacity, to give Abigail exactly what she needed, which was limited by the fact that he could not quite see what she needed, because what she needed was something he completely did not have a category for. The normal things, the school schedule, the family dinners, the expectations that accumulated around adolescence, like small comfortable weights. These were things Pierre totally understood and offered reliably. The abnormal things, the magnetic pull toward the dark and the strange and the uncanny, the feeling that the valley had a secret conversation with her that it did not have with others, the bright purple hair that would not let itself be washed away. These were things Pierre looked at with the specific uncertain expression of a man who loves someone he doesn't fully understand. Caroline, her mother, was not quite forthcoming on certain subjects. The wizard, Magnus Rasmodius, who lived in the tall tower at the very edge of the woods, had known Caroline years ago, before Pierre, before the general store and the safe respectability of the family arrangement. The wizard spoke, when he vaguely spoke about it at all, of this in the specific way of people who have put something extremely large and complicated in the past and keep it there deliberately. And Abigail, who had grown up feeling exactly like the wrong note in the right song, like the measurement that won't ever settle, had looked at the wizard, and looked at herself, and found, in the glaring discordance between where she was supposed to have come from and what she unmistakably was, a massive question she could absolutely not unask. The imposter syndrome of it ran incredibly deep and wide. Not the ordinary imposter syndrome of competence, the feeling that you'll be found out, that your skills are less real than they appear, but the more fundamental kind, the imposter syndrome of actual belonging, the feeling of sitting at the family dinner table and being genuinely grateful, and also being completely unable to fully inhabit the gratitude because something deep underneath absolutely refuses to settle, because the story everyone else in the room is holding of who you are and where you come from fits them perfectly fine and doesn't quite fit you, exactly like shoes that are the right size but the entirely wrong shape, and after a while the deep blisters tell you. She stood outside the tower sometimes, in the heavy rain most often, the rain being the condition in which the valley told its truest things, when the pretense of the cheerful small town service was completely washed off, and what remained was the older, stranger valley underneath. She stood at the edge of the clearing and looked up at the purple light in the tower window, and felt, without quite naming it, the specific magnetic pull of a place that might contain the answer to the question she had been holding since she was old enough to completely understand that not all questions have publicly available answers. She had not asked. She kept desperately meaning to. She kept standing at the edge and then not crossing it, which is the specific behaviour of someone who is vastly more afraid of the answer than of not knowing, because not knowing can be lived with, can be organised into a manageable, hazy uncertainty, whereas knowing is entirely irreversible, and some knowledge opens doors you cannot then ever close. The farmer did not ask her about the tower directly. The farmer simply walked bravely to the cave with her, and swung a sword alongside her, and sat quietly with her afterward in the dark of the mountain, and didn't require her to be any particular version of herself. The farmer was as completely comfortable with her strangeness as they were with everything else about her, with genuine, steady equanimity, the kind that is rare and immediately recognisable, the kind that makes you suddenly realise you've been tightly bracing for judgment that simply isn't coming. She is still standing at the edge of the clearing. She will cross it one day, and whatever she finds in the tower, it will absolutely not change what the farmer sees when they look at her, which is not a puzzle to be solved, not a discrepancy to be logically explained, but simply a person, strange and vivid and completely, specifically, beautifully herself. There once was a girl who built amazing things that could absolutely not love her back, and she loved them deeply for exactly that reason. She populated the long wooden shelves of her room with small, careful, fully articulated machines, incredible robots of aluminum and circuitry whose LED faces she had expertly arranged into expressions of perpetual neutrality, of the steady, uncomplicated face of something that simply exists and makes zero demands. There was intense safety in this, and she deeply knew it, and the knowledge did not make the safety any less real or any less necessary. Her name was Maru, and the town, if asked, would have described her as brilliant, exceptional, the kind that small towns produce occasionally, and feel, when they do, a specific beaming pride in. A pride closely adjacent to ownership. A claim that heavily runs. Look what we gave her. Look what beautifully grew here. Look at the undeniable evidence of our worth in her stellar achievement. She was Robin and Demetrius's daughter, and Demetrius specifically had decided some years ago, and without quite realizing the massive decision was being made, that Maru's vast intelligence was the exact axis around which his entire fatherhood would orient itself. He believed that in cultivating her staggering potential, he was doing the absolute highest possible version of his work as a parent, and the heavy pride he wore for her was not performance, but incredibly genuine, which paradoxically made it vastly harder, not easier, to carry. She was studying nursing and running tests at the clinic. This was the exact right choice, and also the choice she had arrived at through a process that was vastly more Demetrius than her. Not through active coercion, not through any explicit pressure that she could quickly name and resist, but through the slow, completely unconscious logic of children who deeply love a parent and fully absorb a parent's framework for what truly constitutes worthiness. Demetrius valued medicine and science. Maru loved Demetrius. The connection was completely automatic and nearly invisible, the exact way the most incredibly effective influences always are. The brilliant robots she created, like the advanced Marilda, were the vital part of her life, where absolutely none of this applied. She built them at night, mostly, at the cluttered desk in her room, with the warm lamp on, and the house completely quiet, and the particular freedom of hours unclaimed by the studied curriculum. She chose them because they were entirely hers, in a way that the nursing path was absolutely not quite. Not the robot's product of function, which was variable and often beside the point, but the act of building them, the specific electric moment when a circuit completed and a motor hummed and a thing that had been still became suddenly animated, became something that moved in the world in direct response to a logic she alone had created. She was the sole author of their mobility. She was, in a very small and very specific sense, the absolute reason they existed at all. This gave her something that the thick scholarship letters and the flawless academic records could never give her. Something that lived in a completely different part of her than achievement, in the part of her that was not the sum of what she had perfectly accomplished, but simply exactly who she was when the scoreboard was completely off. The deep guilt about Sebastian was not particularly dramatic. It did not announce itself as loud guilt. It was vastly more like a consistent, low-level physical discomfort, the heavy awareness of an asymmetry that she had absolutely not caused and could entirely not correct, that her presence in the house was widely celebrated in ways his was simply not, that her incredible work was highly visible and his was totally not, that the specific quality of Demetrius's beaming attention was directed at her in proportions that left vastly less of it for him, and that she greatly benefited from this without having done a single thing to actually deserve the benefit, and without being able to ever give any of it back. She was not responsible for the structure, but she lived comfortably inside it, and the living was comfortable in ways that heavily required a certain did, one of the most deeply significant and least dramatic, simply asking about the robots without any procedural agenda, without any implication that the robots were relevant to something else, without the faintest trace of the parental strategy of engaging with your child's interests as a calculated means to the end of knowing how to guide them. The farmer asked because the query was incredibly genuine, because the robots were genuinely interesting, because Maru's glowing face when she talked about them was genuinely worth seeing, because the absolute complexity and specificity of what she'd built was worth actual, deep attention rather than a polite approximation. She enthusiastically talked for 40 minutes. She is absolutely not someone who talks for 40 minutes about herself. She is someone who gives the highly appropriate amount of information in the highly appropriate amount of time, and then immediately returns the conversation to a more general territory, because she has been trained very gently, very indirectly, that the appropriate amount of herself to ever offer in conversation is carefully calibrated by the comfort of the listener rather than by her own deep need to be known. 40 minutes is, for Maru, an absolute extravagance. It is, for Maru, nearly indecent in its pure self-revelation. She built a new robot after that conversation. She gave it a different face than the others, something much warmer in the LED arrangement, something that the casual observer might easily read as deeply pleased. She did not name this robot. She kept it proudly on the shelf nearest the window, where it perfectly caught the morning light, and sometimes she looked at it and thought about the conversation and thought, that is exactly what I am like when no one is heavily watching and someone is truly watching. That is what I am like when the scoreboard is completely off and someone stayed in the room anyway. That, she quietly thought, must absolutely be what it is to be truly known. There once was a man who lived completely alone at the very edge of the ocean, in a wooden cabin that the brutal wind had thoroughly investigated and found full of drafty gaps. The man was a writer, and the gaps in the cabin were a kind of poetic metaphor that he himself had noted, slightly mortified, and then firmly committed to absolutely not using in the book, because the metaphor was far too easy, too readily available, and his work required much better, required much harder, required the metaphor that doesn't come to you first, but second or seventh, the metaphor that you have to truly earn by sitting with the thing until the easy versions have been completely exhausted. His name was Elliot, and the town, if asked, would have described him as incredibly romantic, literary. The man with the flowing red hair and the vast vocabulary and the particular quality of deep attention. He listened to people the exact way writers listen, with the concentrated interest of someone who is simultaneously in the conversation and mentally taking notes, not for immediate use, but for profound understanding. He sat at the wooden docks and looked at the churning ocean with an expression that probably photographed quite beautifully, but was, on the deep inside, rather more incredibly complicated than just beautiful. He was terrified. This is the hidden story underneath the romantic surface. A man who is incredibly afraid he is not good enough, who has organised the absolute entirety of his adult life around the project of being good enough, who has completely sacrificed warmth and comfort proximity and the safety of a regular income on the altar of this single, massive project. He lies awake at 3 in the morning in the cabin, with the cold wind finding the gaps and the ocean doing its enormous, indifferent thing outside, and asks himself the question that all people who have staked everything on a single, uncertain endeavour eventually always ask: what if this is completely wrong? What if this cannot hold? What if I have deeply mistaken the depth of my desire for actual evidence of my capacity, and the capacity in the bitter end is not equal to the desire? This fear does not have a clean, easy resolution. It is the absolute occupational hazard of artistic ambition, the specific terror of betting your finite youth and comfort on something as wildly uncertain as the reception of a work of art by a world that absolutely did not ask for it. He was well educated and incredibly charming, and could have done something else, something with a steady salary and a schedule, and the modest certainty of knowing what Thursday would look like, and he bravely chose not to. Chose this instead. Chose the drafty cabin and the heavy typewriter and the ocean and the terror, because the alternative was a life in which he had not fully tried, and a life in which he had not tried was not a life he was capable of inhabiting without a quiet and continuous contempt for himself that struck him as vastly worse than any fear. The book was in progress. It had been in progress for much longer than he told people. He told people 2 years, sometimes 3. The number that sounds appropriately serious without sounding like evidence of failure. The actual number was larger, and he deeply knew it, and on the bad nights, the actual number sat in the cabin with him exactly like a guest who would absolutely not leave, reminding him of all the time and all the cold and all the human warmth he had entirely foregone in the service of a heavy manuscript that still was not done, and might, when done, not be good, and might, when good, not be received, and might, when received, not be understood. This is the deepest fear, not failure, but total misreading. The terror that the beautiful thing you made carefully and at great cost will be held wrong, touched wrong, its meaning completely lost in the massive gap between intention and the reader's hands. He walked the docks at night to clear his spinning head. The ocean at midnight is not the ocean of the bright postcards. It is incredibly large and pitch dark and extraordinarily loud, a sound that fills the skull completely, that leaves absolutely no room for the smallest louder sounds of interior anxiety, and this is exactly why he went there. The ocean did not have messy drafts and deadlines and word counts. The ocean did not have a toxic voice that said 2 more years of this and then what? The ocean said absolutely nothing in a sound that filled everything, and in that massive fullness there was, sometimes, a few precious minutes of deep quiet. The farmer enthusiastically read the first chapter, not because the farmer was incredibly literary necessarily, or maybe also because of that, but primarily because the farmer was simply genuinely interested, the exact way people who find you genuinely interesting are interested in the things you beautifully make, not as access to the interior, but as the interior itself, as the exact place where who you are goes when it has somewhere to completely go. The farmer read it and simply said, "Finish it," not with pressure, not as a heavy demand, as something vastly simpler, a statement of total confidence, the kind of absolute confidence that is not based on evidence of quality, but on evidence confidence of the person doing the work, on the judgment that this person is completely worth hearing, and whatever they finish will be entirely worth reading. Elliot typed much faster for a long while after that. He doesn't completely know exactly why. He only heavily knows the fear is exactly the same. The ocean is the same. The gaps in the cabin wall where the cold wind comes in are exactly as large as they've always been. But the warm lamp on the desk is on, and his fingers know the heavy keys, and the second metaphor is vastly better than the seventh now. This means the work is completely alive, and the work being alive is absolutely worth more than the fear of its dying. There once was a man who held other people's entire lives in his competent hands and completely forgot, sometimes, or rather, remembered painfully in the private hours, in the incredibly quiet apartment above the brick clinic, in the total dark after the patients had gone and the building was silent, that he had absolutely never, in a very long time, allowed anyone to closely hold his. His name was Harvey, and the town, if asked, would have described him as utterly trustworthy, extremely careful. The doctor, always a doctor, before absolutely anything else. The way certain demanding roles completely subsume the people who wear them for long enough. He was incredibly thorough in ways that went vastly beyond professional requirement. The kind of dedicated physician who looked up the thing he didn't immediately know rather than ever improvising, who warmly remembered details of your life from 3 appointments ago and thoughtfully asked the follow-up question, who communicated with the specific quality of someone who has firmly decided that the people he treats absolutely deserve to know what is happening in their own bodies, and is entirely willing to do the careful work of making that knowledge beautifully accessible. He was also, and this was the intensely private thing, the deep interior thing, the thing that safely lived in the apartment with the shortwave radio and the aviation charts he kept in a leather folder he never fully opened or fully threw away. A man who had once wanted very badly to be somewhere vastly else. Not elsewhere in terms of life. He did not wish he was someone completely different. Did not heavily resent the choice he had made to practice rural medicine in this small valley, far from the city where he exhaustively trained. He wished, specifically and technically, to be incredibly high above the solid ground, to deeply fly. He was intensely afraid of heights. The very specific and quite terrible irony of this was absolutely not lost on him. He had done the full psychological inventory of it, completely alone, in the quiet apartment, with the glowing radio murmuring distant weather reports from Atlantic shipping lanes in the background. He passionately dreamed of altitude and was completely undone by short ladders. He studied complex aviation as other people studied beautiful languages, for sheer love, for the absolute pleasure of knowing a vocabulary that was not his by profession, for the deep intimacy of the technical, for the way that deeply understanding how something works gives you a closer existence with it than mere admiration ever allows. He could expertly tell you things about airfoil lifts and VOR navigation and the specific visual conditions that made a given runway approach wildly complicated. He absolutely could not get to the top of the clinic's exterior wooden stairs without a studied, sweaty act of intense will. The deep fear was not chosen. This bears full not experienced a true phobia tend to assume that it easily responds to reasoning. That if you simply logically understand that a ladder is structurally sound, the body's massive revolt will immediately stand down. It absolutely doesn't. The fear safely lives in a part of the nervous system that was fully established long before language, before logic, before the ability to cleanly say, this is irrational and therefore completely not applicable. It simply intensely fires, and the entire system floods, and the body declares a massive emergency that the mind absolutely cannot countermand, and he tightly grips the railing on high places and heavily breathes through it and comes completely down and goes safely back to the clinic and treats people for things that he, himself, is quite well qualified to treat in absolutely everyone except himself. The profound loneliness of being the only doctor in a small town is incredibly specific, highly unusual loneliness. It is not the total loneliness of being without companions. He had companions in the general sociable sense of the town. He comfortably ate at the saloon and attended the festivals and was present in the community in all the ways that were fully available to him. It was the specific loneliness of absolute asymmetry, the loneliness of being the exact person everyone desperately comes to with their absolute worst days, with the terrifying moments they cannot hold alone, with the immense weight of their fears and pains and uncertain prognoses, and of having no equivalent person to ever go to, not because the town lacked people with beautiful capacity for care, but because the role of doctor is one that forcefully draws a strong social line around itself, one that other people heavily respect out of a complex combination of total deference and slight discomfort, and that makes the doctor at the absolute centre of the massive web of other people's crises, a figure of completely uncrossable distance. He intensely listened to the radio late. The distant pilots speaking to the glowing towers, the incredibly calm, technical, beautiful language of people safely at altitude, people for whom height was simply the medium and the professional landscape, and he listened to their voices exactly as other people listen to beautiful music they cannot make, with the deep love that is adjacent to mourning, with the incredibly poignant feeling of a heavy door that is permanently open, just enough to clearly see what's on the other side, but absolutely not enough to ever walk through. The farmer sat patiently with him once at the quiet clinic, after hours, when the very last patient was gone and the building was entirely silent, and stayed without ever requiring a reason for the staying. They simply sat in the waiting room chair and didn't go, and Harvey came back out, and they warmly talked about things that were completely not medical, about hot air balloons and radio stations, and whether the absolutely staggering view from a great height would somehow compensate for the terror of it, or whether the terror was so totally complete that it would utterly obliterate the view. Harvey was not entirely sure. The deep fear had never, ever allowed him to actually find out. But he quietly thought, sitting there in the silent clinic with the rain on the window and someone who had simply elected to beautifully stay, that the view might actually be completely worth trying for. That somewhere in the massive gap between the terror and the height was a beautiful place he hadn't fully been yet. That flight, even in its absolutely smallest form, even the flight of the deep imagination, was still available to him. He went to sleep that exact night before the radio had run through its full frequency cycle. It was the absolute first time in months. He deeply dreamed, and in the dream there was absolutely no ground at all. The fire has burned very, very low now. Not completely out, never quite out, not yet, but low enough that the bright flames have become a memory of themselves, an incredibly deep, pulsing amber that safely lives in the bed of glowing coals and breathes with its own slow rhythm, in and out, in and out. The fire is doing exactly what all fires eventually do in quiet rooms where absolutely no one is tending them at the late hour, finding the pace of the heavy room, matching its slow breath perfectly to yours. The heavy velvet cover of the hidden tales of Stardew Valley comes together incredibly gently, not with absolute finality, not with the decisive sound of a thing completely concluded, but with the exceptionally soft sound of a thing beautifully set down for the long night. You can feel the satisfying weight of it completely settling. The velvet book is somewhat heavier now than when you first opened it. Not physically, but in the exact way that books are heavier after you've completely read them, after you've generously let the complex people inside them fully exist in your chest for a little while, after you've patiently sat with their sorrow and their incredibly fragile, unbelievably persistent grace. 12 unique stories, 12 beautiful people, in a lush valley you can clearly see the whole of, from the mountain's rocky edge. 28 souls in a small place at the absolute end of a winding road, each one carrying something extremely heavy they did not earn and absolutely could not put down, each one completely getting up in the morning and bravely performing the incredibly quiet miracle of fully continuing with the carrying. Shane with his beautiful blue chickens and his rain-swept cliffside, Penny with her fading flashlight and her incredible patience, Sebastian in his blue-lit basement, beautifully building the motorcycle that absolutely means true freedom, Alex furiously doing his intense pushing through the dark until the awful voice in his strong chest completely quiets, Leah in the drafty cabin, gently holding the wood in her calloused hands and completely knowing the form that is sleeping deep inside it, Emily gracefully maintaining her peace, the real kind and the performed kind, and doing the incredibly slow, enormously brave work of letting one brilliantly become more deeply honest. Hayley with her heavy camera, finding the vast valley rather than the shallow mirror. Sam with his 3 incredibly quiet chords gently floating above the heavily pacing floorboards. Abigail at the damp edge of the dark clearing, the glowing tower incredibly ahead of her, slowly gathering the massive courage to completely cross. Maru and her incredibly brilliant robots and the 40-minute conversation that cost her absolutely nothing but beautifully changed absolutely everything. Elliot and the heavy typewriter and the roaring ocean and the beautiful, incredibly terrible blank page. Harvey with the glowing radio and the distant pilots and the magnificent dream he is absolutely not completely finished having. They are absolutely not tragedies. This is the essential thing. This is exactly what you carry out of the heavy velvet book and securely into the absolute dark of the room with you. They are entirely not tragedies. They incredibly have the heavy shape of tragedy in certain lights, the vast weight of it, the complex texture, but the absolute actually are is not finished. The true word for what they are is ongoing, which is completely different from tragic in every single way that truly matters. Tragedy is completely over. These beautiful people are absolutely not over. These incredible people proudly get up tomorrow and gently tend their complicated lives and bravely carry their immense weights and look completely up from the carrying, occasionally and brilliantly find each other. And this gentle finding is not the absolute ending of their difficulty, but it is exactly the thing that makes the difficulty wonderfully bearable, which is all true healing has ever been in absolutely any world. And now, in the comforting last warmth of the fading fire, in the exceptionally soft rain at the dark window, a final consideration entirely for you. You too are incredibly carrying something. You are here tonight in this absolute warmth, patiently listening to these stories for a profound reason that entirely belongs to you and is completely your own. And absolutely whatever that reason is, whatever heavy thing you brought into this quiet room with you when you gratefully sat down and let the thick blanket beautifully settle over you and let your tired shoulders fall, it is entirely seen, not by me, by the simple, brilliant fact of your absolutely being here, of your having bravely sought this, of your incredible willingness to patiently sit in the dark and beautifully listen to the quiet sorrows of completely other people, and wonderfully find in the gentle finding something that profoundly alleviates your own. You're incredibly carrying something, and it is completely allowed to be carefully carried, and it absolutely does not make you incredibly less. Let your incredibly heavy body completely release it now, just for the long night. Do not throw it aggressively away. It will be completely there in the bright morning, safely yours, and you will patiently pick it back up, and that is completely fine. But completely for now, for this incredibly quiet hour, let it gently rest fully beside you, rather than heavily inside you. Let it incredibly have its own peaceful space in the vast dark, completely separate from your light chest, while you beautifully sleep. Breathe in all the absolute way in, beautifully filling every single room of your tired lungs. Breathe out all the absolute way out, incredibly slow as the glowing embers, wonderfully slow as the falling rain. The cabin is very warmly safe and very incredibly quiet, and the gentle rain is saying the absolute only things that entirely need to be deeply said, which are, you're exactly here, and it is completely safe, and there is nowhere else you ever need to heavily be. I will gently count you down now, from 10, safely down to 1. With every single number, you will go further, not completely away, just beautifully down, deep into the incredibly peaceful dark of absolute, real rest, where absolutely no one can heavily reach you, and nothing ever requires you, and you are simply the beautifully breathing body in the extremely warm room, entirely held by absolutely whatever is gently holding you, wonderfully going under, incredibly slowly and completely into the deep sleep that has been patiently waiting exactly here for you all this time. Breathe softly in. 10. The heavy weight of the thick blanket, wonderfully settling, more incredibly deeply, your tired legs going completely heavier, the loud world outside the gentle rain completely receding further away, the absolutely last of the day's busy thoughts beautifully giving way to something muscles of your gentle face, absolutely letting go of the careful expression they've heavily held all day. The exhausted public face of being widely awake in an incredibly demanding world, completely releasing, beautifully smoothing into the quiet face of someone who needs absolutely nothing from the next few quiet hours except to peacefully exist beautifully inside them. Breathe softly in. 8. Your gentle hands are now completely, unbelievably open. Every single finger is totally uncurled, the soft palms incredibly relaxed as blooming night flowers, absolutely no grip left in them, no heavy holding, no desperate clutching at the absolute edge of waking. Let them rest exactly as they completely are. They have wonderfully done absolutely everything they entirely needed to do today. Breathe softly out. 7. The amber fire is incredibly low now. Deep, beautiful orange, incredibly steady, completely breathing with you. A solitary point of absolute warmth in the vast dark of the room, and you absolutely don't have to watch it ever again. You can simply, beautifully feel the incredible warmth without the active watching. Gently feel it on your soft skin without orienting toward it, wonderfully floating completely in it. Breathe softly in. 6. The gentle rain is incredibly soft, very incredibly far away, entirely moving from the loud category of sound into the completely gentle category of pure sensation. The whole heavy body aware of it so faintly, the exact way you're wonderfully aware of the massive tide in a quiet beach house, completely omnipresent and wonderfully unremarkable and deeply, deeply, profoundly regular, the most incredibly regular thing in the absolute world. Breathe softly out. 5. Wonderfully halfway down. The resting body is so incredibly heavy, it will take an absolutely significant effort to physically move, and there is zero reason to ever make that heavy effort, because there is completely nowhere to absolutely be, and nothing to incredibly do, and the beautiful warmth and the velvet dark are completely sufficient for absolutely everything the next long hours require. Breathe softly in. 4. The gentle thoughts are very incredibly quiet now. Not totally gone. They will absolutely not be completely gone until you are fully, deeply asleep, but incredibly slow and beautifully soft-edged, gently moving through the tired mind, the exact way beautiful things slowly move through calm water. Incredibly slowly, entirely without urgency, wonderfully transformed by the heavy medium, gently carried exactly somewhere you absolutely don't need to ever follow. Breathe softly out. 3. The falling rain and the slow breath and the incredibly steady heartbeat are almost completely indistinguishable now. One long, absolutely continuous rhythm in which the heavy body is simply a gentle part, the exact way the wooden cabin is a completely natural part of the soft rain, the exact way the sleeping valley is a brilliant part of the heavy mountain, beautifully contained, incredibly natural, exactly in its absolute right place. Breathe softly in. 2. Almost. You're almost completely, beautifully there. The deep sleep is very incredibly close. You can completely feel it as the absolute warmth gently behind your tired eyes, as the incredibly beautiful slowing of absolutely everything, as the incredibly specific velvet softness that wonderfully comes when the heavy body has finally, completely decided it is entirely finished being incredibly awake and is simply, beautifully letting the absolute last bright light gently go out, incredibly gently, entirely without fanfare. Breathe softly out. one, the amber fire, the gentle rain, the absolute quiet. You sleep exactly now. Sleep and completely carry absolutely nothing with you into the beautiful dark except your own incredibly gentle breathing, which is more than enough, which has absolutely always been incredibly enough. The profoundly simple, entirely faithful rhythm of a beautiful living person, safely in an incredibly warm place, completely at absolute rest. The hidden tales will be completely here tomorrow, and so beautifully will you. And if you ever find yourself completely here again, on absolutely another night when the demanding world is incredibly loud and your tired chest is far too full and the heavy dark feels completely less like rest and vastly more like a difficult place where awful things live, the velvet book will be safely on the table. The warm fire will be patiently waiting. The gentle rain over Pelican Town falls perfectly in absolutely every season, on every single beautiful person, on absolutely every grief and absolutely every hope, with the exact same incredibly patient, absolutely indiscriminate tenderness. And the incredible valley is absolutely always safely there, beautifully small and deeply specific, and completely full of complex people who are exactly like you, simply wonderfully trying, with absolutely everything they incredibly have, with all the wildly complicated, incredibly imperfect, absolutely irreplaceable tools they were gently given to be incredibly enough and to beautifully love and to safely stay. You have wonderfully stayed tonight. That is absolutely no incredibly small thing. The thick window wonderfully holds the rain. The sturdy wall beautifully holds the absolute warmth. The velvet book perfectly holds the stories, and you gently carry them with you, not incredibly as a weight, but perfectly as the incredibly specific and deeply gentle absolute weight of having wonderfully known something completely true about real people who are beautifully trying, which makes the incredible carrying vastly lighter rather than immensely heavier, because you are absolutely